Hey everyone, this is Raymond, your co-host on the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch for live updates about future content. You can check us out on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. You can also become a founding member of our podcast by going to patreon.com/fpphilosophers, where you can support our show, get access to our blog, and learn more about the host of the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. Thanks for listening.
Welcome back to the Front Porch Philosophers podcast. I'm your host, Thomas Jared Farmer, joined as always by my co-host, Raymond Perrier.
How's it going?
Raymond and I are at a conference here in Claremont, California, so Mike will not be joining us today, but in lieu of that, we do have two of our close friends with us. First is the fabulous Kirsten Gerdes. She is assistant professor of humanities and philosophy at Riverside City College in Riverside, California. Her primary areas of focus are women's studies, religion, and philosophy of personhood. She holds a master's in humanities and social thought from NYU and BAs in global studies and philosophy and music composition from Azusa Pacific University. And she's currently completing her PhD in philosophy of religion here at Claremont Graduate University. Say hello, Kirsten.
Hi, this is Kirsten.
We're also joined by our friend Lucas Scott Wright. He's currently a PhD student in German program in the Department of European Languages at UC Irvine. He holds an MA in Religious Studies from UC Santa Barbara and an MA in Theology and Philosophy and Literature from the University of Nottingham. And he has a BA in Theology and Philosophy from California Baptist University. His current research focuses on modern Jewish thought and European history and thought. Say hello, Lucas.
Hi.
I want to thank you both for joining us. The conference that we're at, the theme of which is autonomy, diversity, and the common good. So we thought we would have a conversation about the common good and about the nature of identity. Yeah, identity and politics in particular. So what do you guys think of the term identity politics? Does that have any specific meaning for you?
I mean, when I think about it, I think of the way it gets mobilized, I guess, in contemporary American discourse, and definitely in, is it Anglo-American, right? Because like the UK and Canada are exempt from this. Usually, right, someone, I'd say more conservative or maybe more moderate comes out in our democratic debates, right? Like, we shouldn't be so focused on identity politics. We should talk more about unity. Can we swear? Yeah, this is bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's complete bullshit when it gets used there. One of the papers we just heard, I do think in the example of Germany is really interesting, though, even though I didn't like the paper very much. He's right to point out, the author, that Identitätspolitik in Germany is definitely more of a right-wing term. So the concern with migrants, the concern with refugees, all these different left-leaning, the things that we would associate, here with identity politics, like LGBTQ rights, that frustration on the right with that, they actually begin talking about identity politics. So it's what does it mean to be folk German?
It becomes very nationalistic.
Exactly, yeah.
In the German
and
context.
racial, right?
And in the French context too.
Yeah. So that's what conjures for me.
And just on those subjects, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are. There's such a difference in size. That somebody brought this up in one of the presentations as well. That size size matters in these discussions sometimes. The smaller nation size, yeah. The smaller the size of the nation, typically, not necessarily, but typically the more homogenous. This was also brought up. Do you think that is why identity politics takes different shapes and forms or is weaponized by different sides of the political spectrum, is because of being either mostly homogenous in culture and in race and religion and all these things versus places that are not?
I mean, it might play. I don't know off the top of my head what I would say about that. I think it can't be the only factor. Okay. I think in terms of location, a lot of the places that were mentioned in that list, so it was like Switzerland and Monaco, Singapore, like all of these nations which they were saying were relatively small, were also relatively wealthy and had a lot of economic power at least. they're also more isolated or surrounded by more homogenous populations. So, like, you think about Switzerland, which is, you know, a relatively small in size in terms of like geographic area, but also is located in a part of Europe in which it's sort of surrounded by, it's not that it doesn't have diversity. And I saw actually on the face of one of the Swiss people in attendance when the person who was talking about, I think it was whether it was Professor Min or someone else who had said something about the relative homogeneity of the place, and they had this like look across their face like, well, we have, you know, and I'm thinking, of course, like you have French speaking Swiss, and you have Romansh, and you have the German, and there is tension there, right? Because they claim different cultural heritages. So there is sort of a pushback against that, but at the same time, like if you compare
it's also like
that,
missing the point, right?
it's missing
like,
the point.
It's completely
And you
missing
think
the
about
point.
like, and of course, like in the U.S., it has to take it falls differently because the U.S. and its particular history of like colonialism, how the country as it's come to be, the U.S., that history has I think contributes in a way that it doesn't necessarily contribute to some of those other nations that were mentioned, because not that they don't have their own history of problems of colonialism and definitely, you know, problems of racism, whatever. They are, it's a different history, and that, you know, that material history matters to how it ends up developing.
True.
Yeah, and I would say too, right, like in that particular discussion, my own feelings about the relatively strong claims that the Swiss seem to be making at this conference, vis-a-vis like their own blindness to their own context, like whatever. I liked that Joseph probably, like, you know, he pushed back on that and said, you know, we're not, of course we're not talking about like just geographic space, like that would be dumb. We're talking, it's more actually what Enrique Dussel talks about in a lot of his work, where he talks about dependent and independent nations. And at the time when he was writing about this, where I've encountered it most recently, right, in the 70s, it was the United States and the Soviet Union, and basically talking about how like you have these other nations, right, that more or less are conscripted into, it's what Joseph was saying yesterday, right, they're conscripted into service of these proxy wars, or even economically forced to make trade deals, and that, you know, they can't, like that's what it means to be a smaller nation. So you can have a lot of space, doesn't really matter, but these kinds of power dynamics, so like the idea of Switzerland, in this particular example, one of the things that was said to me later was, you know, well, we're not part of the EU, so you can't really. And I was like, no, but you're literally at the center of fucking Europe. Like, I'm sorry. Like, I don't care if you're not part of the EU or like you don't use euro or something.
And there are a lot of people who are trying, like, I mean, they have a whole thing against Germans coming into Switzerland to steal their jobs because the situation in Switzerland is so much better. And they actually have a lot of problem. Like, I lived there in Zurich for a semester, and not that I witnessed it personally, but had a lot of conversations both with Swiss Germans and with Germans from Germany who gave me different perspectives on, like, Swiss Germans were like, we don't want any Germans in our country. Like, they're coming to steal our jobs and take, you know, everything, blah, blah, blah. And then you had the Germans who were like, we don't understand. Like, we speak the same language, sort of. And like, the Swiss Germans were a lot nicer to me than I saw them being. And they were like, yeah, you should come move here and get a job. And I'm like, aren't you just saying? And they're like, but that's the Germans. And I'm like,
sounds familiar.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's where I think, like, yeah, that, like, right, like, it's completely
the same discourses. It's just the players are always different.
Yeah, this idea, you know, we're just completely missing it's like using nuance to obfuscate the reality that, like, you're just as shitty as like the continent you're literally on and in the middle of. Like, sorry, the U.S. is bad too. Audience, it's not just about Switzerland or something.
Well,
can I interrupt? And just, I want to say, yesterday, Lynn Tonstad made the point in talking about identity politics. That I want to reiterate here, which is where the term identity politics comes from, and it was basically coined out of the 1970s sort of Black feminist movement, and it was the Combahee River Collective, which was published anonymously, although after the fact, like, you sort of can look up who various contributors to it were, but it was signed by the Combahee River Collective, and they made sort of this statement in which ultimately, I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there. The writing, the statement is about how, as they were members of both a civil rights movement working for Black rights for Black people in America, and also they were part of the feminist movement coming out of the 60s and working for the rights of women, and finding themselves in this space of identifying with both of these sort of special, quote-unquote, special interest groups, but neither one of those groups really grasping the whole of their identity, because on the one hand you had predominantly white feminists having a lot of power who sort of didn't understand what the struggle was for Black women, and then in the civil rights movement you had Black men sort of at the forefront who weren't understanding the struggle,
Right.
and that's of course a sweeping statement but it, not understanding the struggle of Black women, of being a woman. And so the Combahee River Collective basically makes this statement, when Black women are free, everyone will be free.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea being the position, specifically the social location of Black women is such that they are sort of suffering under these systems of oppression because of the intersectionality of their identity. And so this is sort of the root of that identity politics. And of course it has come to be, as Lucas has said, weaponized in very different ways in the modern context. But its history as a term is rooted in the Combahee River Collective, and you should read it if you have not read it.
It's interesting though that in the American context, when we hear identity politics, what I tend to think of is a right-wing talking point against so-called leftist politics. We don't really have robust leftist politics in the United States anyway, but when people decry the advancement of identity politics, they typically have in mind something like minority rights, as opposed to kind of the economic drive of traditional, blue-collar democratic politics. And it is interesting to look at that in the context of York, where you said the people who are they're utilizing identitarian language are specifically right-wing groups. How essentially you're using this similar terminology in order to position yourself over against an other, which is it's odd to me that in the American context, the right, who are utilizing identity politics as much as the left, seem to be inured to the fact that they're doing that, or at least they're pretending as though they don't know that they're doing that, when they're deeply invested in identity politics. Like everything is positioning and everything is dog whistling and all of these different factors.
So why do people do it? What are the benefits of talking about identity politics? And then we'll weigh that against the dangers. But there certainly was a benefit with these women, right? That was I would imagine that was how they saw it. And then of course we see pitfalls in it. So I guess if you could just start with something like that.
I mean, just say up front though, like they're not the same thing, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So the question about benefits and pitfalls isn't so applicable across the board, because identity politics here in the U.S., in the way that it was originally used, is certainly not what it's demonized as. It's certainly not the identitarian movements that we see in Germany or elsewhere in Europe. So I just want to, like that needs to be clear. So I don't know, in the American context, I don't know.
Well, I would say that it kind of boils down to the statement that I often repeat among friends and colleagues and to my students, which is the loss of privilege is not the same as oppression. So what happens when I think the right mobilizes and deploys this concept of identity politics is that they're sensing that they have some kind of loss of rights, which is really the fact that because for most of the country's history, if you've inhabited a space or social location of privilege, being cisgendered, being white, being male, being middle or upper class, that those things you are oftentimes blind to that privilege. And so when the public starts to be more egalitarian, when other groups start gaining rights, or when the rights that they should have always had are finally enforced, that does then mean that those in privilege are losing their privilege. But just because you've lost privilege doesn't mean that you are being oppressed. And I think that's what the right has mobilized this idea of identity politics, because what they feel is, my rights as a Christian and to say Merry Christmas to people and to have Merry Christmas on my Starbucks cup, and my ability to pray in school, and I want to make sure that I can still I don't have to hire a gay person if I don't want to. I don't have to serve gay people at my business if I don't want to. Like, all of those things are on the basis of like religious freedom or what have you. And all of that is sort of to say their identity as like conservative Christians is being mobilized because they're experiencing that loss of privilege as oppression. Whereas on the other side, you actually have people who were materially
genuinely
oppressed and still are in many ways. And so that's why they're not an equivalent.
So you think that that's basically a conflation between rights and privilege? That's insightful. I like that.
Yeah, I'd say too, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about, so I had an experience when I was living in Hamburg. The woman I was staying with, this like really wonderful, like 75-year-old like Turkish woman, Turkish German. We had a couple discussions that really sort of troubled me, I guess, because and I've had a couple discussions with other Germans like this since speaking specifically about identity and migration. And so usually the conversation goes, on their side, we're really horrified, how you're treating your immigrants from Mexico. Like, the fuck's wrong with you guys? But then they'll turn around and be like, our streets really did used to be a lot cleaner, or something like this, right? Like, so I was having a discussion with this woman, and it was interesting, because her father came over in one of the waves in the 70s of Turkish immigration that really reshaped in West Germany society and also their economy. Like, they needed these workers to fill jobs. So she has that background. She lived in Egypt, Spain. I mean, like, she had multi-culti, right? Like, she's very like multiple cultural background, and is the daughter of an immigrant. And it was interesting to hear her talk because she was talking specifically about, she's saying stuff like, I don't, what it means to be German or whatever, like, it wasn't really the point. Like, she had a concern almost though with this kind of like what's the liberation theology phrase? Preferential option for the migrant, to the extent though that she had just broken her arm and she had to wait, for 6 hours to be seen. But migrants are, according to her, were able to get in a lot quicker. And Germany does have some issues, but I understand with taking care of elderly people. So that's a thing. So no, I am interested, actually, like, I'm skeptical of some of the things she was saying. But it is interesting. That's not the only German I've heard from who they'll say, no, it's not about like race or something. We just like, and like, they'll be the first to say, I think a lot of the migrants that are coming in are learning German. So it's not even like here because here too, even the demand of English is bullshit because like we don't need that really. But like in Germany, okay, like to do certain jobs, you do need to speak German just because like it's unsafe if you don't, and everything is fucking German. So I am interested, in these different ways, like not, so I think we're talking like on extremes, but I think even in this middle road politics in Germany, there is this concern, I don't think it's necessarily about, on the extreme right, it's obviously about cultural degradation and loss, but there is a concern, I think, in this more middle, even like left-leaning, not like left, but like left-leaning sort of politics where, there is a concern over just like, we're in a society, like we have to like make this work. So like overextending and just giving away too much in terms of not making enough demands on people, society doesn't work. Like it starts to fall apart in a certain sense.
Well, because what you're talking about is cultural values, right? So like the whole, the streets are.
The street thing, I don't. Yeah, the street thing, I'll give a fuck about. But yeah,
well, but
but they do.
Because right, the streets are clean and the trains run on time. Like that's the whole stereotype of Germany. And
it's just a lie. Obviously, the trains suck.
Right? No. But I would say that like you're talking about cultural values, and this is the question of when you allow. People into your country, and again, I'm using here language that I would find problematic anyway about allowing in your country.
Yeah, I find everything I just said problematic, just to be clear.
I
just shouldn't explain the problem.
To use the language, right, when someone is coming, there is accommodation when you invite someone into your home. Like, this is always the metaphor that people use, right? When you invite someone into your home, like what is considered proper, how are you hospitable, how can you exercise hospitality, and then in return, again, to sort of theorize this, like what is expected of you as the guest.
Right.
But I have a whole problem with that being the language, because I think what that does is set up already sort of like an oppositional you-them relationship.
And also like rights to land and identity, right? I
Yeah.
mean, because like here, right, like that's, but the same in German, like it's like if you're born here, like all those right wingers here, it's like you're fucking born here. It's not like you made a decision to have American citizenship, so then to place that demand because of sheer contingency, that you can claim this identity over against them and make these demands of them as a guest, right?
Yeah. Well, the analogy, well, I know that this is just the analogy that is usually used, and that's the reason why you're mentioning, but the analogy does present all sorts of issues with regards to ownership, and not just that, but complexity. Like, so part of the problem with the analogy is just the complexity of issues, right? So like international immigration policies are just much more complex than all of what goes into the decision about whether or not you allow a stranger or an acquaintance to stay in your home.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, that's something that whenever I talk about immigration in like a contemporary moral issues class or something, that's the analogy that people go to. Well, would you let a stranger stay in your home with your daughter or something like that? And like, first off, there's all sorts of issues. The way that you're setting that up, there's already some automatic fear of the other. But the main thing I think is it's not a stranger. Like, you vet people coming into a country, right? You at least have some functional idea about who they are, where they came from, what they're about, their background, more or less. Depends on the country, right? The country of origin, the country of destination factors into how much you know about a given person, but still. Anyway.
What does identity refer to when we're talking about it here?
Whatever you want it to refer to.
It's just anything, right? I mean, could there be alliances that transcend, race and gender and stuff like that in terms of identity politics?
Historically, among social movements, especially on the left, it's always talked about in terms of like coalitions. So you recognize that you can't necessarily, like that someone coming from this, special identity characteristic here versus, characteristic A, characteristic B, if we want to talk, let's just say you said race and gender. So someone who has is a minority in terms of race, someone else is a minority in terms of gender.
Yeah.
The issues aren't the same. You can't, they're not in the sense of like an identity in A equals A.
Yeah.
But there is in relation to the larger whole, right? So they have a marginalized position, both of those, like both A and B here, in relation to the social whole. And so the coalition model says we have some similar interests. We have some similar goals in trying to gain more recognition, rights, the ability to survive and live. And so we can sort of build a coalition together, recognizing that you're not, like the whole idea in an ideal sort of way is to say we can recognize that we have a shared goal and then work together to do that. And so it's about coalitions, and particularly on the grassroots level, in grassroots organizing, like that's how that works.
Yeah.
There is some critique to be had about whether or not coalitional politics actually does end up doing what it is trying to not do, which is to make all differences the same. And then what you sometimes end up with is a situation in which those who really are in a very minoritized position end up still being left out.
When we come to these issues in Mississippi, the United Methodist Church is going through growing pains with dealing with inclusivity with regards to the LGBTQ.
Growing pains is an interesting.
Yeah,
way
that's
to
a
put it.
gentle way of saying it.
They're
It's
fucking
optimistic.
falling apart
Yeah, it's
because they
optimistic
can't.
is what it is.
But we're being optimistic right now. It'll probably be bad for the churches in Mississippi, but we'll see. But the biggest struggle that we've had in trying to create a coalition in support in places like Mississippi and Alabama, the southern states, to create inclusivity and open-mindedness and open doors, our policies, open hearts, open minds, open doors, open table, really, to the LGBTQ community is being, in many ways, there's this tension because the Black community in our church feels like they haven't gotten their due. And you find that the
Quite rightly
coalition,
so,
yeah,
also.
quite rightly so. You find that the coalition ends up being extremely white, and then when we're sitting in these rooms talking about how to deal with the LGBTQ inclusivity, you have people who are like, this is a very white context, and we need to be reaching out to our black brother and sisters, and we're not doing that. And so there's this, it's coalition building is difficult.
Yeah.
And sometimes, even if they could win battles together, they don't want to because of other difficulties that are. So it's just complex. I just wanted to throw that out there because it's an interesting.
Well, part of let's say when I say traditional left, what I really mean is like traditional in the sense of like focus on economics. So the critique of, quote, identity politics from that position of economics is to say that, well, this is a kind of a transcultural factor, the idea of being lower class based upon the economics of the 1% kind of oppressing everyone. So yes, we may all be different, but what we have in common is the fact that we're all under the boot of the oligarchs, right? And so if we could somehow get past our differences in order to recognize our mutuality in terms of our economic basis, then we need to de-emphasize these differences so that we can operate as a collective to fight the powers that be. And so to nuance that, though, of course, the problem is, yes, we may all be economically disadvantaged at certain levels, but my particular economic disadvantage can't be, other factors that impinge upon my identity can't be discounted as elements of that marginalization, right? So, yes, poor white male, you might be marginalized in terms of economics, but if you're a black female and you're also marginalized in terms of economics, then the whole characterization of that takes on different aspects. And so I think that part of the issue with coalition building is the emphasis, unlike in terms of an honest question, is the emphasis on identity politics helpful or less than helpful in trying to create a basis to go after kind of the 1%?
Well, I'll put Lucas on the spot because when we decided that this was the topic we were going to discuss, he the question is are political identity battles or just identity of politics, any of that inevitable? And Lucas said yes. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Or is it just like
I think it is what it is.
It's a
Like,
description of how this works as
yeah.
opposed to a prescription of how we get things done?
I mean, even classic political theory, right? I mean, this is what it's all about. It's about negotiating. I mean, like, Rousseau's like really romantic, right? With the will of the people or some shit like that, which then reaches its limit because you have to kill the people. The spirit of the people in the form of the state has to kill the people that aren't conforming. It's like a very weird part of social contract. For Montesquieu, right, different forms of government, but it's always about like these different sort of like affects you have to inculcate in people through education, unless you're talking about despotism, because then the only affect you want to inculcate is fear. So it's about like managing. It's all about like economically managing, and any kind of, even in like representative or like representative monarchy, right? That's like right, like it's all about managing like different classes of people and like sort of positioning people, and like it's an economy, it's a social economy, it's a political economy. So I don't. I think it's completely, I mean,
so
even in a despotism where, I mean, like, right, China right now is like really having a fucking hard time, or maybe not having a hard time. That's the problem.
the popular.
We see it there even, right? Like it's alleged. It's not even really. It's not a democratic system, but they're still dealing with this question of what do we do with people that are not. What is it like? What's the dominant class? It's Han, right? The Han, and then these religious groups and these people sort of on the frontiers that they're doing this thing where they're putting Han people there and like really trying to build out and mix populate because they're trying to eradicate this identity, to say nothing of the camps. So I think
a very sophisticated and subtle form of genocide, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, that's like a really extreme example.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know how. I mean, like even German politics, like fuck. There's a reason they couldn't become a country, in time, right? Like, in Brandenburg, and then like this whole debate over like the Kleine and Große Deutschland. Like it's like this really like weird, like even on that level, they speak the same fucking language. It's pretty homogenous racially. It was at the time, right? Like they still couldn't become a country like without like I mean, like France and Spain and the UK, everyone was becoming country before them
Yeah.
because they couldn't really negotiate this. So I just think it's, yeah, what do you think?
Well, I was gonna say, like, when you were talking about like pushing people into camps and whatever, like, I would say, like, we would say, oh, that's the extreme example, and yes, it is. I think gerrymandering functions that way in our
Yes.
political system, right? Which is, I think,
Yeah.
one of the biggest problems in our political system, along with like the Electoral College.
Mhm.
But what happens in gerrymandering and these redrawing of districts is done in such a way very much to try to silence or erase whole populations of people.
Yeah.
And so while it may not be actual death camps, if you then put them in these ways in which you have completely rendered them impotent of any kind of voice in politics, what you've done is strip them of any ability to try to gain more ground politically, which may inevitably, but may lead to their actual physical death, right? So,
Yeah.
it's not as direct, but it's...
No, and that's like, I think that the question on our politics being inevitable, I think, like, the answer is yes, yes, but like the question, I think it's yes because the question the question doesn't make sense, right? Once you realize that, because it's like, no, like all we have are these like entrenched identities.
Yeah.
This brings me back to like the question of, can you envision now like Marx's ideal society, right? Like the classless, whatever. Like, what would that look like if that's kind of what your question is saying? Is it always is it inevitable identity politics? And I feel like even if, for me anyway, it's really hard to imagine anything outside of the situation because the situation feels so, like, for as many steps forward, there have been so many steps backward. So it just feels like...
Marx is an interesting example too, because there's that like, I mean, Marx is great, but also there's this like really, I think, for a lot of people maybe who really like Marx and like now, they don't, maybe there's not like a tearing enough with the dangers of the sort of messianic vision that Marx has, like, and this shows up in the Jewish question text on the Jewish question, because like, right, the argument is against Bauer is like, no, like they have political freedom and it sucks, but there's still a reduction of what it would mean to be a Jew, because it's like if you just clear this other shit up, then neither Greek nor Jew, right? It becomes this, which but like it seems a little fucked up, right? Because then it's like this idea that somehow the perfect society actually is an eradication of all difference, because we're just a bunch of cool, like,
well, then maybe the question
we're all
should
just
be
cool.
maybe the question should be then, if we go back to the Combahee River Collective, if we actually all were invested in working for not just the survival but the flourishing of, let's say, like Black trans women's lives, right? Then all of our own situations of precarity in relation to whatever the dominant systems are would also be solved, wrong word, along the way. And so, like, that's the whole point, is that if you can be invested in, beyond in a coalitional sense, but actually invested in the lives of people who are in that situation of the most precarity in relation to the systems of oppression, you are actually still indirectly working for your own liberation as well.
Yeah.
That's the whole point.
Yeah.
That makes me think of when Gianni Vattimo is talking about kind of living in a pluralistic society and the attempt to. So he's abandoned the idea of the erasure of difference, as you said, and so how then do you live in a pluralistic society when you seem to have all these competing narratives about identity and even about things as seemingly basic as truth? Well, he utilizing characteristically Christian and more specifically Catholic language, he talks about charity, and you have to have charity, but essentially it's not that different from solidarity or, as you said, just having a concern for the other, and to say that in the other's flourishing lies my own salvation, and so that if I want to get ahead, if I want my group identity, whatever that is, to get ahead, then I have to be concerned about those at the margin, because if not, then we live, in the state of nature, right? Of all against all.
Sure, but how do you, in large part, the theme of this conference, a lot of the papers has been, philosophy of religion conference, so making these like theological, ontological appeals to like some sort of grounding, for these things. So I can talk all day, like Graham Ward, this paper, like let's get real. Let's talk about like creation and like really it's about like contingency, right? But you know, I was just talking to Elliot about how, you know, in Heideggerian language, the sort of mystical coincidence of opposites that he's talking about, right, performs, following the critique of ontotheology, this sort of twofold function of the genitive. So it's not that it's not that you do away with grounding. Like that's not Heidegger's point, which is why, and as I said, like philosophers of religion that miss this, like especially here in this country, like fucking Caputo and those people, like I think really messed this up, because like no, like Heidegger's fine with grounding. It's about that it's grounding. It's like it's this sort of perpetual fluctuation. That like there's limits to that appeal to a sort of ontological ground though, right? So like we can talk about charity, we can talk about these things and how, like, but making that move from the theological language and the philosophical language and the maybe just the conceptual language to like, to Kirsten's point earlier, like people pushing back on the paper, rightly, you know, you were saying people aren't rational. You can't just make appeals to these arguments. You can't just even, I would say you can't make appeals to things like charity actually without accounting for this gap. And so what I'm wondering more and more, as fucked up as it sounds, is, you know, because Carl Schmitt was a piece of shit. But like, I think he might be right about like how the political functions, the category of the political. And also I'm not quite convinced that like, with so many issues pressing that like, vis-a-vis climate change, for instance, like I'm not actually sure that like the state jailing people is not the right, like actually exercising its sovereign power, making a decision to impinge upon rights, because people, especially people who don't want, you know, they irrationally will not cede rights to people, right? At what point, because things are so dire and like we're running out of time, do we actually empower the state to say, you know what, like this sucks, but like fuck these people?
Yeah.
Not LGBTQ people, the people trying to take their rights.
Well, history.
That sounds really fucked up. I realize it sounds totalitarian, but like if
It
you're
is a
staring
little
down the barrel of
totalitarian.
like the
It
climate
is.
change, no, it is. But I mean, like, but if you're staring down the barrel of like the kinds of issues we're facing, like how else in time?
Yeah.
But even let's take climate change off the table, right? Like, people's lives matter now, like in themselves. So like, how long do we have to wait for like asshole Christians to like come around or something, to stop killing people for being gay or for being like whatever,
Yeah.
right? Like I don't know, like there's a gap there, and I think it's really fucked up that because we were so unable to deal with that gap, and I mean maybe there's no way, like the only option I can think of is this like super fucked up option
Well,
where like, you know, like Schmidt takes that and runs the wrong direction, I think, but it's just because he recognizes like, oh, there's this 0 point where like the law is founded on its suspension.
Yeah,
Like
but-
someone has to fucking do this. And so theologically, because he's pulling it from theology, this is the appeal to theological language and to an originary kind of like system or commonality, right? Like common, like an Urpunkt. He's just following it out in terms of like the actual law. So I don't know. I don't know if that makes sense. I just like I hear these things invoked, and I've heard it all
No,
this
it
whole
makes
time
sense.
here,
It's just
and
like
it's just like I
the-
don't really know what to do with it at this point,
Yeah.
other than like maybe think these really dark thoughts,
Well,
and that troubles me. That really troubles me. 'Cause I don't want to be a totalitarian.
thoughts
Like,
though, because I feel like as much of a slippery
Yeah.
slope as that becomes, we could just as equally go to the French Revolution or other forms of
French Revolution's a good example.
collapse or
Haiti, right,
or
yeah.
Haiti. Eventually, if the distribution of resources and
Right.
oppression gets too much, then people start killing the people who are oppressing and redistributing them.
But maybe this is a question for you three though, because I'm like still finding my way back into like theology a little bit. But like, how would you account for this gap? Like, or what do you do with this? Because like we all are like politically pretty aligned, and we all would want to make an appeal
The
to
gap
like
between, just be clear.
like this theological appeal to like an originary whatever, or even democratically, right? Like we're all here together, we should all, you know, because we're all here together or something. And like that means, I mean, for a lot of people they can take it the other way, right? Like cool, we're all here, like time's short,
Yeah.
I'm gonna do my shit, fuck you,
I
right? Or like whatever. And again, I mean that's a really simplified version, but like it's not always given that those appeals can actually ground the kind of political and social values, I guess, right? Or affects that we would want subconsciously, sort of subconscious training that we want to inculcate in people, precisely because people are so irrational and they don't respond to like those kinds of appeals rationally. They respond to it oftentimes very selfishly and scared.
Well, but
Like out of
they,
fear.
like the research that I was referencing in the Q&A in the last session actually points to the fact that that psychologically what humans respond to is relationship and community, and that if you want to change someone's mind who has some kind of bias, whatever it is, you can't present them with an argument. You can't present them even with facts, because
like
facts and
proximity,
data,
right?
it is. It's proximity and it's relationship. The problem with that, of course, is that if you're asking then people, let's say, who want to deny the very life of, let's say, Black people, right? But you're like, okay, so to fix this, we can't make arguments about Black people's personhood.
Right.
You're just going to try to put them in a relationship, and then you have this whole thing of like, that's putting certain populations in, like, is that making it precarious? Are you asking them to do
Right.
labor that they shouldn't have to do and suffer more and relive trauma or live through new trauma? So there is that problem, but psychologically, what at least we have access to at the moment in research, it is all through relationships that you can change. Like, you change your mind not because of data or because of arguments, but you change your mind because of relationships. And I would say, like, on a not in this sort of political sense, but if you've ever sat under, let's say, a professor who has touched you in some way, and I don't mean that in a creepy way, but in like an intellectual or spiritual way,
Impacted you and stuff.
Thank you. Thank you for that correction. I'll take that. That they can change your mind, right? Like, because of how they are with you as a person, as opposed to you just picking up their book. Like, maybe their book changes you too, but there is something about like having an actual relationship with a person that can have an impact on the way you see the world.
Or conversely, you think someone's really shitty and you hate them, but then you're like forced to engage their work, which I was in this last paper. And that experience was really difficult for me to get over, because like for the sake of scholarly integrity, you have to do it. So no, I agree. Like, those relationships really, like I remember thinking, like, this is so stupid that like I have these like negative feelings about this book. I mean, the text itself I didn't fully like, but like it was because of those relationships. And that's like a way smaller level than like.
And I don't know
the
if
state,
Yeah.
no, but like this is the deep canvassing idea, right?
Yeah.
I think that was a really good point.
I don't know if it's theologically sexy or even that insightful, but one of the big
I think theologically sexy is the greatest phrase.
one of the big takeaways from, I think, Kierkegaard's work, if you try to take his ironic project in its entirety as a theologian and demonstrating the irony of so much of the ways that we approach life, and then trying to understand that in connection to his theological, Lutheran tendencies, he's very fixated on just simply thinking of God coming to earth to exist in the shittiest parts of life. And it seems like that, I don't know what that means conceptually, like if you were to create some systematic approach to it, and that's part of, I think, Kierkegaard's whole thing is like, you can't, because there's something in that relationship building of just being with people, not having answers or not having like any per se like theoretical or deeply theological understanding of that situation, but just actually being there and then trying to at least start from that would be a potential way to fill the gap, I would say. Maybe not.
I'm not a
that's
Kierkegaardian, right? But I think so I defer to your knowledge on that. But I would say that, like, when you're saying, like, Kierkegaard would be against the systemization or whatever, making it systematic, that is because for him the systematic is the ethical, right? And that's where the system is, but the religious is the singular, right? Like the before God kind of thing, which can't be made into
before God through the
through
human
it, right?
relation,
To
right?
read,
Not
gotta
just
read
like
works
in
of love.
isolation.
Yes.
Yeah. And
God
I'm
is
not.
in the
And
other.
I made mention of this about Graham Ward's paper because I found it interesting, and it's really like it's not. It sounds like it's bad, like, oh, he's against the ethical, right? Because everybody's like, oh, being ethical is good, right? Well, it's about the narrow focus of a system. Systems, if a system of thinking or belief or whatever it might be is the reason that you get into situations or relationships with people, then there are a lot of problems with that, because a lot of systems can't do that, can't compel you. So I found it ironic in Graham Ward's paper that he was self-deprecating and thinking that theologians have been in our armchairs thinking about relationality, and we have like immigrants coming to the borders. What do we do? And it's like, well, we go to the borders and we get in relationship, with these people, and then that is somehow the starting point of a more deeply intuitive theological perspective, but a non-systematic, because it develops as the system develops, right? It's continually reconciling. I don't know enough about Jewish studies to make this, but the one in the many is, interesting on that point, because it seems to have that perpetuating evolution in it.
No, I
don't
mean,
know
like
if that's
the
a correct
reception of
analysis.
Kierkegaard by someone like Rosenzweig, but mixing like Buber talks, or Cohen talks about like, like religion and reason, right? How they have to go together, and what religion actually adds is the capacity to feel suffering, like to recognize suffering as suffering, because the system can't do it. And so this is something that, and this corresponds to his notion too of like, the uniqueness of God. So it's not the singularity of God, like numerically, it's like towards Einzigkeit. And that's what like Levinas and Rosenzweig then take their notion of like the other is the revelation, and this is like underneath the political. Because for Rosenzweig, the state is always fucked. Like after World War I, that was the state. He's just like, the state is always going to be bad, and it's just a bunch of myths that can only renew itself through violence. And then for Levinas, it's very similar, right? But he doesn't even really want to go to the political, because he thinks that effaces precisely the transcendental other that appears in the revelatory moment perpetually when you're in relation. So there's it's a similar idea, and I think that they probably, they've obviously read Kierkegaard too.
Well, I think
we should go back.
we should go back and hear Marlene's final comments.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. That was great.
Awesome.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Front Porch Philosophers. If you did, go follow us on Twitter at Philosophy Porch. If you liked it so much that you want to support us monetarily, then go to patreon.com/FPPhilosophers and become a $1 subscriber today. Every dollar goes to adding more content and buying up more server space, so the more you spend, the more you get. In any case, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Front Porch.